Hello there and welcome to this first video in my Summer of Synths series. My name is Bo and I run this Synthesizer channel here, but today's video is not by me. I've invited a couple of YouTubers, synth and music tech YouTubers, to host their videos here on my channel during the summer months because I needed actually to have a little break. And today's special guest is no other than Gabe Miller. I'm sure some of you have seen him around. If you haven't, go and check him out. I'll drop a link to his channel down in the description. So without further ado, here is Gabe Miller comparing some of his favorite grooveboxes.
Thank you so much, Bo, for having me. As you said, my name is Gabe Miller. I make electronic music here on YouTube and walk you through the entire process with a special emphasis on portable, self-contained music production devices. The three that we chose for this video were very specifically chosen not because they're super similar, but because they're actually pretty different and can hopefully give you a pretty good introduction to what's out there and different approaches to making electronic music in a standalone, compact setup. And we should start with their similarities. At a high level, all three devices are completely self-contained music production stations, capable of synthesizing sounds, sequencing melody and drum patterns, launching those patterns in some capacity, mixing, and recording. But within that list of criteria, there's quite a bit of room for very different approaches and sounds. So let's get into it. Let's start off with the VerseLab MV1. Its sound engine is a lot more powerful than I think a lot of people realize. It's built on the Zen Core engine that Roland has built into multiple devices. It's meant to be very clean, polished, modern, but also capable of some really authentic recreations of some retro stuff. Case in point, something like this. You've got a Juno chorus in here. I'll get into the effects in just a second. On the other hand, you've got some slightly more modern stuff that you would hear in maybe like a modern space trap track, but still got the vintage edge to it. But you can also get quite a bit of grit out of this engine as well. And hopefully you are able to pick up on that in the audio examples that introduced this section. Actual control over the synth does require some menu diving. So let me dive into this main pad. If I want to edit the synth, I have to go into the specific section because synth parameters and effects apply on a section by section basis, which does get a little bit weird to work with. So I'll go to edit, go to the clip settings until I get all the way to tone setting. And then I've got access to a bunch of parameters of the tone, including stuff like the tuning, whether it's mono or poly or legato, the bend range, portamento, filter cutoff, resonance, ADSR, vibrato controls, octave controls, even some voice assigned stuff, unison. There's quite a bit of stuff you have in here. I wouldn't try to design an entire patch from scratch. I would use a computer with a Roland Cloud subscription for that. But you do have quite a bit of control over your sounds just in the device itself. I should also mention that all of these tone settings apply to a sample as well. So this sample can get mapped out to the keyboard and pitched around accordingly. In this case, this is chromatic, but you can have a bunch of other scales loaded onto this grid of pads as well. And you can even have stuff like glide, vibrato, and ADSR and filters all apply to samples as well. And if you connect this to your phone and load up the ZenBeats app, you get slightly more hands-on controls of a lot of those synth parameters. You also have access to quite a bit in the effects department. You've got delay and reverb sends that just everything can go to. And once again, on a clip-by-clip basis, you can access the multi-effects. And there's a ton of stuff in here, from a Juno chorus to other choruses, distortions, auto pans, EQs, compressors, all manner of filters, other reverbs, fuzz, a ton of stuff is contained in the list of effects. There's a lot to play with, a lot to shape your sound just directly on this device, and that's limited to one effect per instrument. The circuit presents a somewhat different approach to working with synthesis. It's built on the Circuit Nova engine, which is fairly old, and some people will comment on that. I honestly think it sounds fine, and it's capable of a lot more grit than I think people realize, as hopefully the audio demos were able to show. But overall, I think it can sound quite nice. One major difference in working with the sounds of the MV1 versus working with the sounds of the circuit here is that you've got macro controls as your primary controls for shaping your sound. You can't necessarily go in and dial in exactly what your unison or cutoff are doing. You're kind of at the mercy of the patch designer. On the circuit tracks, as opposed to on the original circuit, Novation has tried to rein patch designers in a little bit. So you've got consistent labeling for knobs, and they're hoping that people will assign these macros to these functions. Designers aren't necessarily tied to that. It's just a suggestion that'll create some consistency. So we've got control over your oscillator, scrolling through a wavetable or changing some aspect of it. Oscillator mod. That can manifest itself in a bunch of different ways. Amp envelope. In this case, this is controlling release. Filter envelope. There's a really nice noise layer on this thing. Filter frequency. Cutoff, essentially. Resonance. Really nice to have just immediately here. Modulation. How this is used will definitely vary based on the patch. On something like these 80s patches, it's not going to kick in too much, but on some of these patches, it can really change how the sound behaves, especially with regards to timing. And finally, effects. This is usually assigned to a chorus or a phaser, or occasionally a distortion. So the macro knob system is a trade-off. On one hand, you do lose really fine control. You can't dial something in exactly to your specifications all the time, but what you gain is immediacy. For jamming, this is really nice to have because you probably have gone in and know exactly what the knobs do and have easy and quick access to evolve a sound on the fly during a jam. And you can even use these to do a bit of sound design, or at least some pretty hardcore sound shaping, depending on how drastic the differences are across a knob turn, essentially. You've got slightly more straight ahead controls for drums. You've got pitch, which unfortunately is not quantized to any sort of scale. I would love to see that in an update. You've got essentially your envelope. Not really a filter envelope, just a normal amp envelope. You've got a distortion. You can drive this pretty hard, which I use all the time. And a basic filter. Also super useful to have for samples. So not quite as much control, but they've got controls where it counts. And finally, let's go into effects. Reverb with multiple different sizes. Versus on the other extreme, that's probably a bit much. And then a pretty good delay with a bunch of different settings, from slapback, ping pong, which can help add some width to elements, to some proper ping ponging delays, and a bunch of different timing settings, both in mono and the ping ponging variety. One other important thing to note about the sound engine on this thing, other than the reverb and delay, which are send effects, just like on the MV1, this does not have dedicated effects. Effects like distortion and phasers and whatnot will live in the patches themselves. And if you want to tweak them, they either have to be assigned to macro knobs or tweaked in the components editor on a computer. One effect that you do get on the circuit tracks that unfortunately you don't get on the MV1, sidechain. And you've got multiple settings here to tweak its intensity, and side chains can be independent for all 4 tracks, both for the MIDI tracks and for the synth tracks. And finally, I alluded to this earlier, but you cannot flip samples chromatically on the circuit tracks. You can pitch stuff around and automate that pitch to get a melody out of a sample, but it can be a bit of a pain, so most people probably aren't going to do it, at least not for anything complicated. Samples and synth patches on the circuit tracks are pretty separate beasts. The Model Cycles takes a radically different approach to sound design from the first 2 devices I've shown in this video. For one thing, it actually does have a ton of hands-on control for sound design. It's really more of a drum machine than a Groovebox. It's got a bunch of different FM sound design engines. The kick engine, snare, hi-hat, aka metal, perk, and this tone and chords. The sound engine on this thing can often sound quite punchy. And hopefully you heard that in some of the examples as well. You've got a ton of very hands-on control, and that makes this really fun to work with. You can also push these pretty hard into some kind of chaotic territory. Once again, diving into FM. It can get fairly abrasive. You've got an LFO built in here that is incredibly useful for this kind of sound design. You've got a ton of different chord shapes to work with. This kick is by far my favorite part. Like, I've incorporated this into sample packs, and it's just the gift that keeps on giving. Seriously. The snare's okay, maybe a little dinky in my opinion. The hi-hat can sound fairly metallic, but is incredibly useful. Can function as both an open and a closed hi-hat. So that's like getting really metallic. It's a little more white noise type hi-hat. The perk I don't use all that often. The tone is incredibly useful. It can also make a pretty nice punchy bass. You've got quite a bit to play with here. However, what I usually run into is the fact that the Model Cycles pretty much always sounds like the Model Cycles. It can get kind of difficult to develop a song that sounds like something that's release ready, because for one thing, all of these sounds are monophonic. Like even the chord engine, these chords just live within the oscillator. It's not truly polyphonic, and you've got a lot of layers to work with, but you are going to be limited by everything being mono. You do have parameter locks, and that includes entire engines. So I could have like a kick engine on this step, a snare engine on this step, a hi-hat engine on this step. That definitely helps expand the track count. But even with all that, this thing will always sound like the Model Cycles, and anyone who knows what it sounds like will be able to easily pick it out. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, it's good at one specific sound, and that sound can be fairly metallic and maybe sometimes a little empty. That's good to know going in. I have not really built full songs with this thing. I typically like to use it for short jams or to use it as a part of a larger setup. It's really good at what it does, but what it does is maybe a bit more limited than you'd expect. In my opinion, the circuit is the clear choice for this, and that's not even considering how it works with external gear, which I'll get into in a little bit. Its clip launching and jamming setup is a lot like the Launchpad. This is by the same people who make it, and it's a mainstay of live electronic music performance. So you can launch patterns or even entire groups of patterns contained in the projects on the fly. They'll come in right on beat like this. For drastic changes, like I mentioned. And the master filter. And of course you can do stuff like change the tempo on the fly. And any new project that you launch will come in at the same tempo. So you can pretty seamlessly build up a song, transition between songs, and build up an entire set. I've seen this used to great effect by Ricky Tinez for live stuff. This is meant for live performance. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, you've got the macro knobs, which give you easy access to shaping your sound and evolving a sound in real time. And you can even chain patterns together and groups of patterns together using the scenes, and you can mute and unmute stuff, control volumes and panning on the fly. You've got a ton of control all at your fingertips here. Like I said, it's meant for live. The VerseLab MV1 is a device that I would not bring on stage. It's really not meant for it. It's meant to be a song production studio, and I'm going to get into that in a second here. But for now, what you need to know is that it's not set up to launch clips on the fly or even tweak parameters on the fly, at least not really. It's really designed for building up a bunch of song sections and then laying them out in the song mode. Once again, I'll show that in a second. And then playing that through and then mixing and mastering that song either on the device or in your DAW. I would definitely not recommend it for live playing unless you want something that is backing tracks only. But be aware that you have to load up each song individually. So you'll have to have breaks in between songs, and you're probably not going to be tweaking much, if anything, on the fly. The Model Cycles is a lot more like the Circuit Tracks. It can do live jamming, with launching patterns and tweaking parameters on the fly. However, for me personally, I wouldn't really use it in a live situation. You absolutely could, and you've got enough tracks to make that work, but some of the pattern behavior, in my opinion, is just a little bit clunky, and you're dealing with all monophonic sounds, so there's only so much you can get out of it. You absolutely could do a live set with it. There's a lot of power baked into this thing, but personally, if I was to use it for a live set, I would use it as part of a larger setup, probably as the drum machine. From my point of view, that does seem to be the direction that the design is leaning towards, but of course you do have all the melodic stuff and the chord stuff, so your mileage may vary. The Novation Circuit Tracks is great with external gear. There are some other Grooveboxes out there that do replicate at least some form of this functionality, but the Circuit does it so cleanly. And it functions as not only a sequencer, but also as a mixer for your external gear. So you've got two MIDI tracks that are dedicated to MIDI only. They can't produce any sound on their own. They can only control external stuff. These can act completely independently. They act like any normal pattern containing notes, and you can feed that MIDI data into any external synthesizer. Then you bring the audio from the external synthesizer back into the circuit to get processed by it. So for instance, I've got this patch here on the MicroFreak. The only thing I'm recording is the stereo output of my circuit. This is running through that, living on this MIDI track and getting processed by the circuit. Right now, there's not really any processing on it, so let's change that. Let me get some reverb going. Some delay. Some sidechain. You can, of course, add another external synth to the setup using this other MIDI track. That's super easy to do. I'm just using this one synth for the sake of the example. This is incredibly powerful and very user-friendly to set up. It's great for live stuff and great for like the table full of gear DAW-less setup made a little cleaner and more minimalist than you'd normally see it. It expands the sonic capabilities of the circuit a ton and has made me view the synthesizers that I own in a whole new light now that I know that they can essentially become an extension of the circuit. The one thing to be aware of is that this is meant for live jamming. This is sequencing the synth on the fly, and the synth is playing stuff and feeding it back into here on the fly. You can't record stuff into the circuit tracks. We're probably going to see something like that in the circuit rhythm, but at the time that I'm filming this, we don't have a ton of details on that yet. But this cannot sample into it. That's not the case for the Roland VerseLab MV1 though, which can sequence external synths and record stuff into it. And unlike the circuit, it can actually save that recording and then place it anywhere in the song. You've got looper tracks, which can just accept audio that you record into it, and then that will behave exactly like a pattern, which is nice. So you could just ignore the synth engine in this entirely and just record a bunch of external synth stuff into it if you wanted to. You also have the vocal track. I don't know if your voice counts as external gear, but it's got a ton of stuff for vocal processing in here, a mic input, all that kind of stuff. And you've got a ton of of vocal takes that you can record. I should mention you can only use the vocal track in song mode, and you have to lay something out like across the space of a song linearly. But if you're willing to work with that, you can record not only your voice, but synths into here. That thing that you just recorded will live on this song timeline in the place that you recorded it. You can stack takes or just use them as a way to find the best take. You've got quite a bit of power hiding in this track in terms of building up a song using external synths or your voice or whatever else. The trade-off is that it's quite a bit more convoluted to use, and typically I think you're going to be better served by playing something in live. You could sequence an external device using the MIDI out and then record that in using the line in song mode, but that does require you to momentarily sacrifice a track to that cause. And then from there, once you've recorded it, you could make that track a different part if you wanted to, but that does start getting into convoluted territory, and I might find myself just playing something in live or just recording another layer in my DAW because there's less friction involved in that process at that point. And of course, while you have lots of layers contained in here, there is only one vocal track, and so you don't necessarily get to process stuff separately. Unlike the previous two devices, this has no audio input. So right away, you're going to need some sort of mixer if you're using this in conjunction with external gear. You absolutely can sequence external gear with this, however. It's got its MIDI out, and you've got quite a bit of control over how all that MIDI is routed. The big thing that will probably halt some people in their tracks, pun intended, is that every single track is monophonic, including the chord track. The chord sounds are actually contained within the oscillator itself, so you're not going to have that piped through MIDI, unfortunately. It's still just going to be single notes. And that goes for every single one of these tracks. If I was to use this with external gear, I would probably have both of these synths pull double duty, maybe have the chord track serve as a sequencer for a bass synth, and then have this play some kind of lead part and maybe double that up. And then these would be like a drum machine, essentially. That's how I'd use this. You will need a mixer or audio interface with more than 2 inputs to make that work. I probably wouldn't do a live set with this, and it's not my first choice for working with external gear, especially because on the circuit tracks, you have custom CCs built into the macro knobs, whereas on here, the CCs aren't assignable. That's not a huge deal for me, since I'll usually just lean over and tweak the external synth anyway, but it's something that's at least good to know going in. I personally use the circuit tracks in the studio quite a bit. Because it's so small and portable, it's easy for me to just pick it up, start creating, and then eventually want to flesh stuff out into a full track. So I'll go through the effort to make an entire song on this thing, and I'll bring in external devices. That works for me. I just record the stereo output because this can't do multi-track export, unfortunately, and master that, and that's my song. It does require a bit of creativity to get the most out of the limited track count, and it does require me to be kind of careful when mixing on this thing because I'm not going to get to change it later. And to play a full song, to arrange a track out, I do need to jam it out live. For me, that's a feature, not a bug, because it makes for an interesting video and it's a fun process that I've come to really enjoy, but that is something worth knowing going in. I really like it for the studio, either for some minimalist music production or for some truly fantastic DAW-less jamming, but the minimal track count and lack of individual tracks does hold it back a bit. That's not the case with the VerseLab MV1. This is built for the studio, and there are a lot of aspects that make that very clear. The main thing being the song mode. The song mode is pretty straightforward to deal with. It requires a bit of workflow weirdness introduced because sections are completely independent of each other. So if you want an element to repeat across multiple sections of a song, you have to copy it over. Not a huge deal, but worth knowing. The end result of all that is that you can have a bunch of song sections laid out across these pads, and then all you have to do is hit record, assign a section, move to the next one, assign a different section to it, or the same section, so on and so forth until you've laid out your entire song. And then you can export that directly, or you can record this into your computer via USB, and that will allow you to record all the individual stereo tracks simultaneously so that you can mix and master in post. It gets you the best of both worlds. I'll make 90 to 95% of a song on this thing, get it all laid out. It kind of forces me to think in terms of full songs rather than just short little jams. And then I'll record this into my computer via USB and just put the last little bit of polish on a track. It's a really nice hybrid workflow. Not everyone's going to go for that. For some people, it might defeat the purpose of having a DAW-less device, but for me, it brings me the best of both worlds. And you do have a decent amount of mixing tools just on this thing as well, including individual volume controls that get just locked in on a track-by-track basis, panning, effects, delay, reverb sends, as I mentioned earlier, some basic EQ, and you can dial in further EQ in other menus. And you've even got some basic mastering controls, which is pretty nice to have, and a multiband compressor, 5-band EQ, and a limiter. So if you've gone through the extra effort of doing some automation in the Motion Designer, laying out all of your song sections in a song order, and doing some careful mixing and mastering, you can just export a WAV file directly, and that's your song. Add to that all the inputs this thing has and the vocal track, and you do have an entire studio in a box. So in terms of a device being built specifically for the studio, this one wins on that front. And I should also mention the numerous tracks. These are not restricted to being what they're labeled. These can be synths, these can be drums, all that kind of stuff. For using the model cycles in the studio, I'm not sure it would be my first choice. Like I've mentioned multiple times already, the sound is pretty specific. I probably wouldn't use it to make full songs. It absolutely can be done. I've seen people do it to great effect, but it's, once again, just not my first choice out of the gear that I've shown in this video. It does have USB audio out, which is nice, but that's not multi-track, unfortunately, but it does give you a bit of a cleaner signal and no need for an audio interface. My main studio use for this is simply sampling sounds I've made with it as one-shots and then using those in other devices and in my DAW. It's a really capable synthesizer, especially for more percussive sounds. I've used samples I've created completely from scratch with this thing a lot. Of course, that does mean it gets slightly more limited use in my studio, but if your aim is to create sounds in a hands-on manner that you can use elsewhere, or to do some live jamming that leans into this thing's strengths, I think you're going to have a good time. I would say that the Circuit Tracks definitely wins in terms of fun. This device is incredibly well designed and it's meant to be very streamlined, and that shows. It's incredibly fast and fluid to work with, and it's not that hard to build up the muscle memory for it. If I have a song idea, I'm probably picking up the circuit just out of instinct because it's just like connected to my brain in a weird sort of way. Or if I want to tinker a bit, it's so easy just to pick up the circuit, like sit down on the couch on a whim, start jamming something out, and come up with something cool. It's really built for that, and that shows. And bringing in external synths makes it even more fun because it's made me kind of see my entire gear collection in a different light. As a bit of a con, though, some people might find bumping into the Circuit Tracks limitations kind of frustrating. It does have a pretty limited track count. There's only so much it can do when working with samples. Some people seem to hit a wall with its sound engine. I haven't personally, but that depends on the person. And of course, there's no multi-track out. So if you want multiple tracks, you'll have to record everything separately, which can be a pain. It's definitely a budget device, and some people are gonna say you need to grow past it. I disagree. I think it's incredibly cleverly laid out. It gives people a lot of room to grow into it, and its limitations just force you to be creative. However, I definitely understand if you find those limitations frustrating. The VerseLab MV1 has a much higher learning curve and quite a bit of menu diving, and this will be very frustrating for some people, especially for beginners. At this point, I've been able to get pretty fast with it, and I know my way around it well enough to have it encoded into my muscle memory, but even then, there's some weird design quirks and workflow jank, and I think that's just something that you sign yourself up for when getting a Roland device. That is all made worth it, however, because getting a full song and having it materialize just on this self-contained device that's just sitting on your desk or on your lap is very gratifying. You've got a lot of tracks to work with, a ton of sonic potential for both synth patches and samples, a full song mode. It's really cool to see something come together on this device, and if you can get over the initial hump of the workflow, put up with its quirks, and lean into its sound engine's strengths, you're going to have a really fun time with this thing. It's really satisfying. The model cycles is somewhere in between. There is a bit of menu diving, and it's harder to learn than the circuit, but it's really not bad, and a lot of stuff is really clearly labeled, and the thing I find really fun about it is designing sounds from scratch. I make it a point to rarely use presets, not because I think there's anything wrong with it, but just because I find designing sounds from scratch with the FM engines and trying to get some musical chaos out of the cycles the absolute most fun part of making music with it. It's very inspiring, and there's a weird deficit of budget groove boxes that let you do sound design from scratch, and the Cycles is one of them. The Elektron is another, but that's a different topic entirely. But the FM design is laid out to be intuitive. It's a lot of fun. You can push it pretty hard into some aggressive metallic sounds, and that's a good time. You might have the novelty wear off after a while, but regardless, the Cycles is quite fun to work with. Not quite on par with the circuit, but it's pretty close.
Thank you so much, Gabe, for this comparison. I'm sure it's been very helpful to a lot of people. And to you viewers, if you enjoy his content, go and subscribe to him, and don't miss the next video in the Summer of Synths series, because we have a lot of cool content creators coming up, a lot of interesting content. So be sure to subscribe to my channel as well if you're new here. And yeah, hope you have a pleasant summer. I'll be back with my content sometime in August, so see you then.